Now, let's not focus or fixate on experimental methods. Because, frankly, experimental methods aren't the most commonly used methods in sociology. A lot of times we do our research outside the lab, not using random assignment and several other experimental techniques, rather going out and setting people in the real world using different methods, things like surveys, observational research, and so forth. When we do that, we try to deal with the same kinds of issues that experimental researchers do, including trying to deal with the influence of third variables, trying to deal with spuriousness and eliminate it or control for it. So, how do we do it? Well, we gather data and we do statistical analysis. And it turns out there's a variety of statistical techniques that have been developed to try to control for other variables, assuming you have information or data about them. And if you conduct your research in the right way, you can use these statistical tools to at least indirectly try to isolate and infer how one variable might be influencing another, and simultaneously control for the corrupting, contaminating influences of other variables where you've gathered that data. Now, let's not kid ourselves. Using statistical controls to draw inferences about causal relationships is not as powerful, it's not as strong in terms of internal validity. So there remain serious questions about internal validity when it comes to that type of research. Technically, laboratory experiments typically are better in that one respect. But it's not the only question that researchers deal with, and not always even the most important one. Remember, we have to talk about which way the arrow of causation points, and we also have to talk about establishing correlations. You have to design your research to do those things too. Well, let's walk through each one very quickly. Establishing proper time ordering, or getting the arrow of causation pointed in the right direction. Laboratory experimenters can control when subjects are exposed to what conditions or what stimuli, and then later they can observe how they react or respond. That allows them powerful techniques for trying to figure out what's causing what. Now, again, if you want to do similar research out in the real world, when you can't control who is exposed to what conditions when, it becomes trickier, and then we run into more problems. But again, we've developed a powerful set of statistical techniques to try to deal with those issues. And the underlying logic is pretty simple, although the techniques get really complicated. The underlying logic is you try to figure out which variables tend to change first and which variables tend to change later. Causes tend to precede their effects. So if you can figure out which variables tend to change first and which ones tend to change later, that's a very powerful clue for which way the arrow of causation is most likely to be pointed. Now, there's other tricks we can sometimes use, but we can't deal with all these details in this short lecture series. And then, of course, there's the last and final criteria that we've been talking about, correlations. And a variety of different techniques, experiments, surveys, observational research, and so forth, allow us to gather lots of data in order to do statistical analysis, in order to find out how our variables appear to correlate, how strong those correlations, what direction those correlations, whether those correlations are statistically significant. Now, take a big step back. How you design and execute your research is closely related to those three basic criteria for testing causal theories. Your research can be better or can be worse. Depending on how you do your research, well, you're going to get different results. There's a problem here. We've talked earlier about falsifying or testing theories. At that time, we kind of made it sound like it's obvious that a theory is wrong or right, and we never really went into how you falsified it, how you did your research, and what difference that made. Turns out that methodology, especially research design and internal validity, is closely, deeply related to how we go about falsifying and testing theories. If your methodology, in this case your research design, is very poor, well, it's very difficult to even interpret what your results mean. Because again, using different methodologies and research designs, you're going to get different results. Research with poor research design is difficult to interpret. It doesn't lend itself to a single clear interpretation. It's unclear what it means. It can be greatly misleading, very confusing, or simply ambiguous. What the heck does that mean? Here's the real crux of the problem though. You're testing a theory, you do your research and it says, wow, it didn't work very well. Is the theory really bad? Well, if your research design was sound and reasonable, that would be the natural inference. We really rigorously tested the theory, it didn't work, end of conversation. On the other hand, there's another possibility. Maybe the theory isn't so bad at all. In fact, maybe it's a great theory. But you used research designs, you executed your research in such a way that you gummed up your research. It just doesn't make sense the way you did it. It wasn't really logical or rigorous. You made really fundamental mistakes. Maybe the problem here isn't the theory, maybe the problem is the research design. And how can you tell the difference? Turns out that's a very tricky problem. The larger point is that bad research designs or execution can make good theories look bad or bad theories look good. So that's why it's so important to get research design right, so that you really are testing your theories, you're testing them logically, you're testing them rigorously, and at the end of the day, you can tell what the results mean. You can look at it and say, no, that theory doesn't work well, or this theory works really well, or this is the magnitude of this effect. Your ability to make confident judgments about the usefulness or the truthfulness of theories, or the strength judgments about the strength of relationships, the directions of relationships, all depend on sound research design and execution. Now, some quick clues about how to go about getting good research designs and execution. First of all, planning. Your research is usually going to be only as good as all the work that went into it. Secondly, use as many subjects as you practically can. The more subjects, the better. Third, use sound measurement. Measurement and research design are closely related. And frankly, all that stuff about correlations doesn't even make much sense if your measurements are no good. I earlier made the point that your research is only as good as your measurements. You could make a similar argument that your research designer is only as good as your measurements. So, again, use sound measurements. Gather as much data as possible. Make as many observations as possible. And if you're doing laboratory research, make as many comparisons between groups as is practically possible. In our earlier example, we compared a control group and an experimental group, an extremely simplified, dumbed-down version of a laboratory experimental design. You can be a lot more rigorous and a lot more imaginative. You can have multiple control groups and multiple experimental groups. And the more groups you have, the more logical comparisons you can make, the more inferences you can draw, the more and the better and the more accurately you can test your theory. Complexity, using more groups, making more comparisons, is your friend. Although, by the way, it's something that also comes with some drawbacks. There are trade-offs involved. But still, as a general rule, the more comparisons you can make in terms of comparing different groups of people, the better. Also, if humanly possible, you want to try to replicate your results. Not just doing a single piece of research, but repeating that research more than once so that you can see if you're getting similar results time after time. And finally, you should probably try to use longitudinal research, studying people over an extended period of time if humanly possible. That allows you not only to test your theories better, and by the way, that's critical because theories are something where you have to look at time ordering. Remember that? Well, if you're going to look at time ordering, you have to study people over an extended period of time. You're going to definitely have to study it more than once. Cross-sectional research is like a snapshot. You study people at one point in time. That kind of research really is not well suited to testing causal theories. Longitudinal research is a lot better. But there's another reason to look at longitudinal research, because if you're interested in any kind of social change in the world, any kind, even if you're not testing a causal theory, well, You probably want to study people over time, use longitudinal research. So if you're interested in changes and trends and so forth, don't do cross-sectional analysis. Go out and study the same group of people over time, or take repeated samples and study similar groups of people over an extended period of time. Basic point, do longitudinal research. Now, as we begin to wind down here, I'll point out that there is no perfect single research design. There's all sorts of practical constraints and trade-offs and problems that you're going to have to deal with, and it also will be affected by what you're studying and what your exact research interest or question is. Now, that doesn't mean that different methods and different research designs have inherently have different strengths and weaknesses. I'll grant that in a second. But the point is that there's no perfect research design. But some research designs are clearly better than others, especially in terms of their internal validity. And at the end of the day, you want your research design to test your theories as rigorously as possible, as logically as possible. And if you do so, you'll be well placed to sit back and say, well, this is what that research means, it gives us strong information about how well the theory works, and so forth. Now, next time around, we're going to talk about yet another major issue in methodology. We're going to talk about sampling and external validity. A little different topic. We'll see you then. Thank you.